There are places in the American South where the earth itself seems to remember. Where the air hangs thick with something more than humidity. Where the silence feels like it's holding its breath. This is one of those places. The house stands at the end of a road that most people avoid. Even now, more than a century and a half after it was abandoned, locals will take the long way around rather than pass through the rusted gates that mark the entrance to what was once the Bellmont Plantation. They don't talk about why. They don't need to. Some stories don't require explanation. Some histories are so dark that they survive in the blood, passed down through generations as instinct rather than words. Tonight, the storm that's been building all day finally breaks. Rain hammers against the remaining roof tiles. Wind tears through the empty windows. Lightning cracks across the sky, and for just a moment, the entire structure is visible in sharp relief against the darkness. 3 stories of rotting wood and crumbling brick. Columns that once spoke of wealth and power now lean at dangerous angles. And there, on the 3rd floor, a single window. Boarded shut. Nailed from the outside. That window hasn't been opened in over 150 years. Inside that room, something happened that destroyed everything. Not slowly. Not through the usual decay of time and fortune. But suddenly. Completely. As if the family name itself had been cursed the moment a certain child drew its first breath. The Bellmont line was old. Respected. Their men had built empires on cotton and cruelty. Their women had presided over grand balls where champagne flowed and society gathered to see and be seen. For 3 generations, the family had thrived. Their wealth grew. Their influence spread. They were untouchable. And then, in the spring of 1857, everything ended. Not in war. Not in financial collapse. Not in any of the predictable ways that great families fall. This was different. This was something that began in a locked room, with a woman's desperation and a man's horror, and ended with a birth that no one would speak of. A birth that was recorded in one place and one place only, in a diary that would later be found hidden behind a brick in the nursery wall, its pages stained with something dark that might have been ink or might have been blood. The entry was dated April 12, 1857. Just 3 lines. The child is born. God forgive me. It will end us all. Within 5 years, every member of the Bellmont family was dead. The last one, a cousin who had never even lived in this house, died in 1862, found in a hotel room in Charleston with no marks on his body and no explanation for why a healthy man of 32 would simply stop breathing in his sleep. With him, the name died. The fortune scattered. The house was left to rot. But the story didn't end there. Stories like this never do. They live on in whispers. In the way people cross themselves when they pass the gates. In the accounts of trespassers who've entered the house on dares and left running, refusing to say what they saw but never going back. In the testimony of a demolition crew hired in 1923 to tear the place down, who quit on the first day after discovering the nursery and the door that had been nailed shut from the outside, its wood so thick with nails that it looked like someone had been terrified of what might come out. Or what might be remembered. The local historical society has a file on the Bellmont Plantation. It's thin. Most of the family records were destroyed in a fire that consumed the county courthouse in 1869. Convenient, some say. Too convenient. What remains are fragments. Property deeds. A few letters. Newspaper clippings that raise more questions than they answer. One clipping, from the Charleston Mercury, dated May 1857, just 1 month after that diary entry, mentions the Bellmont family only in passing. It's a society column, noting that Mrs. Caroline Bellmont had withdrawn from public life following the birth of her child, and that the family would not be receiving visitors for the foreseeable future. The tone is sympathetic. These things happened. Women's health was delicate. Privacy was respected. But there's another clipping, this one from a smaller paper, from 1858. Just a few lines. The Bellmont estate has been the subject of much speculation following the deaths of 3 family members in the span of 8 months. Local authorities have found no evidence of foul play, though neighbors report disturbing sounds from the property at night. No names. No details. Just that single word, disturbing. Another fragment, this one from a letter written by a woman named Sarah Price, who had worked as a seamstress for the Bellmont household until the spring of 1857. The letter is dated 1859, written to her sister in Virginia. Most of it is mundane, talk of weather and prices and mutual acquaintances. But near the end, almost as an afterthought, she writes, "I thank the Lord every day that I left that house when I did. What Mrs. Bellmont did, what she brought into this world, I cannot speak of even now. I only know that there are sins so great that God Himself turns away, and when He does, something else looks in." The letter ends there. No explanation. No context. But here's what we do know, pieced together from fragments and whispers and the few records that survived the fire. Caroline Bellmont was 28 years old when she married Jonathan Bellmont in 1852. He was 41, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth along with the baby. The marriage was strategic. Her family had land but no money. His family had money but needed heirs. It should have been simple. But 5 years passed, and there were no children. In that world, at that time, this was not just a private grief. It was a public failure. Caroline's failure. Whispers followed her. Prayers were said. Remedies were tried. Nothing worked. And Jonathan Bellmont began to look elsewhere. If you want to hear the full story of what happened in that house, what was born in that third-floor nursery, and why it destroyed an entire family line, subscribe now. Because what comes next is darker than anything you've heard before, and you won't want to miss a single detail of how one woman's crime brought an empire to its knees. There are records of Jonathan visiting New Orleans in the winter of 1856. Records of him dining with a young widow from a prominent family. Records of gifts sent. Letters exchanged. By early 1857, the rumors were spreading. He was going to set Caroline aside. Divorce was impossible, but there were other ways. Annulment. Abandonment. A quiet separation and a new wife who could give him what Caroline could not. Caroline knew. Of course she knew. And Caroline was not a woman who accepted defeat. To understand what she did next, you need to understand the world she lived in. The Bellmont Plantation in 1857 was a kingdom unto itself. 6,000 acres of cotton field stretching as far as the eye could see. The main house sat on a hill, white columns gleaming, visible for miles. It was a monument to power. A declaration that the people who lived there were different. Better. Chosen. But that power rested on a foundation of unspeakable cruelty. 83 human beings were held as property on that land. 83 people whose names were recorded in ledgers alongside their monetary value, their skills, their ages. They were assets. Tools. Less than human in the eyes of the law and in the minds of the people who claimed to own them. The plantation kept meticulous records. Jonathan Bellmont was a businessman, and he ran his estate like a business. Every purchase was noted. Every birth and death recorded. Every transfer documented. The ledgers from 1857 still exist, preserved in a university archive, their pages yellowed but legible. They tell a story of cotton yields and profits, of investments and returns. And between those numbers, if you know how to read them, they tell another story entirely. In the fields, the labor was backbreaking. Dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Sundays were for rest, though that rest often meant tending small garden plots or mending clothes or doing the 100 other tasks necessary for survival. The quarters where the enslaved people lived were rough wooden structures, barely weather-tight, crowded with families who had no choice but to make them home. The house slaves had it differently, though not necessarily better. They were closer to the family, which meant they were more visible, more vulnerable. They served meals, cleaned rooms, tended gardens, cared for children. They moved through the master's world like ghosts, required to be present but invisible, attentive but silent. Among the people enslaved on the Bellmont plantation was a man named Samuel. The records show he was purchased in 1852, the same year Jonathan and Caroline were married. He came from an estate sale in Georgia. 21 years old at the time. Strong. Healthy. The records note that he could read, which was unusual and technically illegal, though the previous owner had apparently allowed it because Samuel had been useful in keeping accounts for the plantation's blacksmith shop. Samuel worked the fields for 5 years. He married a woman named Ruth, who worked in the laundry. They had 2 children by 1857, a boy of 3 and a girl just over a year old. By all accounts, Samuel kept his head down, did his work, and tried to keep his family together. In that world, that was all anyone could hope for. In March of 1857, something changed. The plantation ledgers show a brief note: Samuel, field hand, transferred to house duty. No explanation. Just the transfer. House duty could mean many things. Serving at table. Tending fires. Maintaining the grounds close to the main house. For Samuel, it meant being closer to the family. Closer to Caroline Bellmont. And that proximity would destroy him. Because Caroline had been watching. She had been planning. And she had made a decision that would crack open the foundations of everything her family had built. Caroline Bellmont was not an ignorant woman. She had been educated, as much as women of her class were educated in that time. She could read French, play piano, manage a household. She understood accounts and could discuss politics with her husband's associates when necessary. She had been raised to be the wife of a powerful man, to maintain his home and bear his children and uphold his reputation. But 5 years of marriage had produced no children. 5 years of watching her husband's interest wane. 5 years of endured visits from doctors who examined her like livestock and pronounced various theories about her failure. Wandering womb. Nervous disposition. Weak constitution. The words changed, but the message was always the same: the fault was hers. And now, in early 1857, she knew that her time was running out. Jonathan was planning to replace her. She had seen the letters, carefully hidden but not hidden enough. She had heard the whispers from servants who couldn't quite keep the gossip from reaching her ears. She knew that if she didn't produce an heir, and soon, she would be set aside. Not divorced, perhaps, but sent away to live quietly on some minor property while Jonathan took a new wife who could give him what Caroline could not. The thought was unbearable. Not just because of the social humiliation, though that was real enough. But because Caroline had spent her entire life being told that her value lay in one thing: her ability to continue a family line. To fail at that was to fail at everything. To be discarded was to cease to exist in any meaningful way. So Caroline began to think of alternatives. Desperate alternatives. Unthinkable alternatives. There's a journal entry from February 1857, part of a diary that Caroline kept sporadically. Most of it is mundane, notes about weather and social calls and household matters. But there's an entry dated February 23 that stands out. I have been thinking much on the matter of inheritance. What makes a child legitimate? Is it the marriage of the parents? Is it the name given at birth? Or is it simply the recognition of the father? If Jonathan would recognize a child as his, would the world question it? Would anyone dare? The entry continues, working through the logic of her plan. She reasons that if she can become pregnant, if she can present Jonathan with a child, his pride would compel him to claim it. Men of his position did not admit to their wives' infidelity, not publicly. The scandal would be worse than simply accepting the child as his own. And once the child was recognized, once it bore the Bellmont name, it wouldn't matter where it truly came from. The line would continue. Her position would be secure. But there was a problem. Caroline couldn't arrange a discreet affair. She was watched too closely, her movements too constrained by the social expectations of her class. Any relationship with a man of her own social standing would be impossible to hide and impossible to explain. She needed someone who had no power to refuse her. Someone who couldn't speak out even if they wanted to. Someone whose word would never be believed over hers. She needed someone she owned. The selection of Samuel was calculated. Caroline had seen him working near the house. She had observed him over weeks, noting his health, his bearing, his features. She had inquired, carefully, about his family, his temperament, his reputation among the other enslaved people. She wanted someone strong, someone who looked like he could be the father of a healthy child. But she also wanted someone who had something to lose. Someone who could be controlled through fear. Samuel had a wife. He had children. That made him vulnerable. That made him perfect for what Caroline intended. In the third week of March, Samuel was called to the main house. He was told he would be working inside from now on, maintaining fires, moving furniture, assisting with various household tasks. Ruth was frightened by the change. House servants were often treated better in some ways, but they were also more exposed to the whims of the family. And there were stories, always stories, about what could happen to people who attracted the wrong kind of attention from those who held power over them. Samuel tried to reassure her. He would be careful. He would keep his eyes down and his mouth shut. He would do the work and come home each night. It would be fine. He was wrong. What happened next took place over the course of 3 weeks in late March and early April of 1857. There are no official records of it. No documents that spell out the details. But there are accounts that have survived, passed down through oral tradition, carried forward by the descendants of people who were there. And there's Caroline's diary, which contains entries from this period that are chilling in their casualness, as if what she was doing was no different from planning a garden party or ordering new drapes. Caroline began by isolating Samuel. She assigned him tasks that kept him in the house late, after the other servants had been dismissed for the evening. She sent Ruth to work overnight in the laundry during the heat of the day, ensuring that Samuel's wife wasn't nearby when Caroline enacted her plan. She arranged things so that she and Samuel were alone. And then she made her intentions clear. The details of that first encounter are almost too horrible to speak. Caroline didn't ask. She didn't seduce. She commanded. And when Samuel refused, when he backed away and tried to explain that he couldn't, that he had a wife, that this was wrong, Caroline smiled. She told him that she understood his reluctance. She told him it was touching, really, that he cared so much for his family. And then she told him exactly what would happen to that family if he didn't do what she wanted. Ruth would be sold. The children would be sold separately, to different buyers, sent so far away that Samuel would never see them again. And Samuel himself would be sent to the rice fields on the coast, where the mortality rate was so high that few men survived more than 5 years. She could do all of this with a single word to her husband. Jonathan wouldn't question it. He never questioned her household management. Or, she said, Samuel could cooperate. He could do what she asked. And in return, his family would be safe. His wife and children would remain on the plantation. He would see them every day. Nothing would change. No one would ever know. It was a choice between horror and horror. Between violating everything he believed in or losing everyone he loved. Samuel, trapped and powerless, chose survival. He chose his family. And in doing so, he became a victim of a crime that had no name in the laws of 1857, because the laws of 1857 didn't recognize that an enslaved person could be raped. The laws said that enslaved people were property, and you couldn't rape property. But Samuel knew differently. Ruth knew differently. And the other enslaved people on the plantation, who saw Samuel's anguish and heard Ruth's quiet weeping at night, they knew differently too. Over the next 3 weeks, Caroline forced Samuel to return to her rooms again and again. Each time, she threatened him anew. Each time, she reminded him of what she could take from him. And each time, Samuel endured it, because the alternative was losing everything. By mid-April, Caroline was certain she was pregnant. She dismissed Samuel back to the fields immediately. She didn't want him close to the house anymore. She didn't want to see the accusation in his eyes or risk that someone might notice his barely contained rage. As far as she was concerned, he had served his purpose. Now he could disappear back into the anonymous mass of field workers, and she could move forward with the next phase of her plan. She had to convince Jonathan that the child was his. This part was easier than it might seem. Jonathan had been away in Charleston for much of March, dealing with business matters. He returned in mid-April. Caroline, clever and calculating, made sure to welcome him home with warmth and attention that she hadn't shown in months. Within a week of his return, she told him she suspected she might be expecting. Within another week, a doctor confirmed it. Jonathan was ecstatic. All his doubts, all his plans for replacing Caroline, evaporated in an instant. He was going to be a father. The Bellmont line would continue. He threw himself into preparing for the child, ordering furniture from Charleston, hiring additional help, making sure that Caroline had everything she needed. Caroline, for her part, played the role of expectant mother perfectly. She withdrew from social obligations, citing her delicate condition. She spent her days in the house, being attended by servants, reading books on child rearing, preparing the nursery. To anyone watching, she was simply a woman waiting for the child that would secure her place and her husband's legacy. But inside, she was terrified. Because she knew that when the child was born, there was a chance, a very real chance, that it would look like Samuel. And if it did, if the child's features betrayed its true parentage, everything would fall apart. She tried not to think about it. She tried to convince herself that perhaps the child would take after her, that bloodlines were mysterious and that no one could truly predict what a baby would look like. She repeated to herself that as long as Jonathan claimed the child, as long as he gave it his name, nothing else mattered. But late at night, alone in her room, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. If she had brought something into the world that she couldn't control. If God, who she had been taught was watching and judging, would punish her for what she had done. The diary entry from December 1857, written when she was 7 months pregnant, shows the cracks in her confidence. I dreamed last night that the child was born with Samuel's face. In the dream, the midwife screamed. Jonathan looked at me with such hatred that I felt my heart stop. And then the child opened its eyes, and they were not the eyes of a baby. They were old. Knowing. Accusing. I woke in terror and could not sleep again. I tell myself it was only a dream. But I fear it was a warning. The pregnancy progressed. Caroline grew larger, more uncomfortable, more anxious. Jonathan hovered, attentive and excited. The household prepared for the birth. A midwife was engaged, a woman named Mrs. Talbot who had delivered half the babies in the county and had a reputation for skill and discretion. And in the fields, Samuel worked and waited. He knew, of course. Everyone in the quarters knew. Word had spread, whispered carefully, about what Mrs. Bellmont had done. About what she had forced Samuel to do. The enslaved community watched and wondered what would happen when the child was born. Some said it would be a reckoning. Others said nothing would change, that the powerful always got away with their crimes, that this would just be one more tragedy added to the mountain of tragedies that was their daily existence. Ruth stopped speaking to Samuel. She couldn't help it. She knew it wasn't his fault, knew he had been given no choice, but the knowledge of what had happened, of what her husband had been forced to do, was a wound that wouldn't heal. Their children sensed the tension and became quiet and withdrawn. The small family that had once found moments of joy even in their bondage was breaking apart. Samuel himself became harder. The light went out of his eyes. He worked mechanically, spoke only when necessary, and spent his evenings sitting outside the cabin staring at nothing. The other enslaved men gave him space, understanding that he was carrying something too heavy for words. And then, on the night of April 11, 1858, Caroline went into labor. It started in the late afternoon with mild pains that Caroline tried to ignore. By evening, the pains were stronger, coming at regular intervals. Mrs. Talbot was summoned. The household went into motion. Jonathan was ushered out of the way, sent to wait downstairs with whiskey and cigars, following the custom that fathers were not present for births. Caroline was taken to the third-floor nursery, the room that had been prepared for this moment. It was a large room, well appointed, with a cradle waiting and linen stacked neatly and everything needed for the birth. Mrs. Talbot examined Caroline and pronounced that it would be several hours yet, that first babies took their time, that Caroline should try to rest between contractions. But Caroline couldn't rest. The pains grew worse. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Mrs. Talbot began to look concerned. Something wasn't right. The baby was positioned strangely. Caroline was tiring too quickly. There were complications. By dawn, Caroline was screaming. The sound carried through the house, out into the yard, across to the quarters where the enslaved people were waking to begin another day of labor. Ruth heard it and felt nothing. Samuel heard it and felt a cold dread settle over him. And then, just after sunrise on April 12, 1858, the baby was born. Mrs. Talbot, who had seen hundreds of births, who prided herself on her calm demeanor and professional competence, made a sound that no one in that room had ever heard before. It was something between a gasp and a sob. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the infant, and had to catch herself against the wall. Caroline, exhausted and half delirious, tried to sit up. "What is it?" she demanded. "Is it a boy? Let me see. Let me see my son." Mrs. Talbot didn't answer. She was staring at the baby in her arms, her face drained of color. 2 enslaved women had been present to assist with the birth, as was common. One of them, a young woman named Bess, moved forward to take the baby from Mrs. Talbot, thinking the midwife was simply tired. But when she looked down at the infant, she froze. "Sweet Jesus," Bess whispered. She turned away, making the sign of the cross. The other woman, older, named Martha, had been through many births. She had seen babies born too early, born sick, born with deformities. She had learned to keep her face calm no matter what she saw. But when she looked at Caroline's baby, even she couldn't hide her reaction. "Mrs. Bellmont," Martha said quietly, "maybe you should rest a moment before." "Give me my child." Caroline shrieked. She was sitting up now, reaching out, desperate and terrified. Mrs. Talbot, moving as if in a dream, brought the baby to Caroline and placed it in her arms. For a long moment, Caroline stared down at the infant. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, horror. The baby was alive. It was breathing. But there was something about it that made every instinct scream that something was wrong. The child's skin was light, lighter than Samuel's, but not white. It was the color of someone mixed race, which in 1858 South Carolina was immediately recognizable and immediately damning. There would be no hiding what this child was. No pretending it was Jonathan Bellmont's legitimate heir. But it wasn't just the skin. It was the features. The shape of the face. The set of the eyes. Anyone who had seen Samuel would see him in this child. It was unmistakable. And there was something else. Something harder to define. The baby didn't cry, not really. It made sounds, weak mewling sounds, but nothing like the healthy wail that usually announced a new life. Its eyes, when they opened, seemed unfocused, staring at nothing. It moved strangely, limbs twitching in ways that didn't seem natural. Mrs. Talbot would later tell her husband, in the privacy of their own home, that she had seen something in that baby's face that frightened her more than anything in her 30 years of midwifery. She couldn't explain what it was. Just that when she looked at the child, she felt the presence of something that shouldn't be there. Something that felt like a punishment made flesh. Caroline held the baby for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she began to laugh. High, wild laughter that turned into sobbing. God has judged me, she said. God has judged me and found me wanting, and this is his answer. Mrs. Talbot tried to calm her. Mrs. Bellmont, you're exhausted, you're not thinking clearly. Get it out, Caroline said suddenly, her voice flat. Get it out of this room. I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear it. Take it away. Martha stepped forward carefully. Ma'am, the baby needs to nurse, needs to be. I said take it away. Caroline screamed. Take it downstairs. Find a wet nurse. I don't care. Just get it out of my sight. The two enslaved women exchanged glances. This was wrong. A mother who wouldn't hold her baby, wouldn't feed it, this was a bad sign. But they had no choice. Martha wrapped the infant in a blanket and carried it out of the room. As soon as the door closed, Caroline turned to Mrs. Talbot. You will tell my husband nothing, she said. Her voice was hard now, controlled. You will say the baby is fine. You will say I need rest. You will give me 3 days before he sees the child. Do you understand? Mrs. Talbot, frightened by the look in Caroline's eyes, nodded. 3 days, Caroline repeated. That's all I need. 3 days to think. But she didn't need 3 days to think. She already knew what had to happen. She had gambled everything on this child securing her position, and instead, the child had destroyed her. It was proof of her crime, visible for anyone to see. When Jonathan learned the truth, and he would learn the truth the moment he saw the baby, he would cast her out. He might do worse than that. He had every legal right to have her committed to an asylum. He could claim she was mad, that her nerves had broken, and no one would question him. Unless the child disappeared. The thought came to her fully formed, as if it had been waiting in the back of her mind all along. If the child died, if it simply failed to thrive as so many infants did in those days, no one would question it too closely. Babies died all the time. Weak constitutions. Difficult births. Childhood illnesses that couldn't be fought off. It would be sad, certainly, but it wouldn't be suspicious. And without the child, there would be no evidence. It would be her word against anyone who might dare to accuse her. And who would dare? Samuel couldn't speak out without condemning himself to worse treatment. The enslaved women who had witnessed the birth wouldn't be believed if they tried to tell what they'd seen. Mrs. Talbot could be paid for her silence or threatened if payment didn't work. Caroline could claim the baby had been born dead or had died shortly after birth. She could play the grieving mother. She could consolidate Jonathan's sympathy, try again to become pregnant, but do it right this time. She could salvage this. But she would have to act quickly. That first night, while Caroline lay in her bed recovering, the baby was taken to the quarters. A woman named Hannah who had recently lost her own infant agreed to nurse it. She took the baby reluctantly, crossing herself and whispering prayers as she did. The other enslaved people gathered around, looking at the child that Mrs. Bellmont had birthed but wouldn't claim. They saw what it was immediately. They saw Samuel in its features. They understood what had happened, or at least part of it. And they waited to see what would come next. Samuel was told about the birth. He stood outside Hannah's cabin, staring at the door, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside. Ruth stood beside him, silent. After a long moment, Samuel turned and walked away. He went to the edge of the fields, where the cotton plants were just beginning to show green in the spring earth, and he knelt there in the dirt. The overseer found him an hour later, still kneeling, and whipped him for shirking work. Samuel took the lashing without sound, without resistance. He had gone somewhere beyond pain. On the second day, Jonathan Bellmont came to see his wife. Caroline, pale and weak but composed, told him that she had lost the baby. It had been born alive but sickly, and despite Mrs. Talbot's best efforts, the infant had died in the night. She wept convincingly. She clung to Jonathan's hand and told him how devastated she was, how she had wanted so badly to give him an heir. Jonathan, who had been preparing to celebrate, was crushed. He sat with Caroline for hours, holding her hand, assuring her that they would try again, that this wasn't her fault. He sent for the doctor. He ordered the household into mourning. He made arrangements for a small private funeral service. And then he asked to see the baby's body, so he could say goodbye. Caroline felt ice run through her veins. She hadn't expected this. Men of Jonathan's class typically didn't view infant corpses. It was considered too distressing, something left to the women. But Jonathan was insisting. He wanted to see his child, wanted to pray over it. The baby was taken away already, Caroline said quickly. I couldn't bear to have it in the house. Mrs. Talbot saw to it. A Christian burial, quiet, as is appropriate. Jonathan looked at her strangely. Without telling me? Caroline should have been consulted. You were in Charleston, she said, which was true. He had been called away on business the day before and had only just returned. I didn't want to wait. It seemed cruel to delay. I thought you would understand. He did understand, or he told himself he did. Grief made people act strangely. And Caroline seemed genuinely distraught. He let the matter drop, though something about it bothered him. Something felt off. But Caroline's real problem was that the baby hadn't died. It was still alive, down in the quarters, being nursed by Hannah. And as long as it lived, it was a threat. On the third night, Caroline went down to the quarters herself. This was unusual enough to cause alarm. Mistresses didn't go to the enslaved people's cabins at night. Nothing good ever came from such visits. The people scattered, pulling children inside, closing doors, hoping not to be noticed. Caroline went to Hannah's cabin and let herself in without knocking. Hannah, who had been rocking the baby, stood up quickly, fear plain on her face. Give it to me, Caroline said. Hannah hesitated. The baby was sleeping in her arms, finally settled after hours of weak crying. I said give it to me, Caroline repeated, her voice rising. Hannah held out the baby. Caroline took it and looked down at the small face. Even in sleep, the child looked weak. Its breathing was shallow. It probably wouldn't survive long anyway, Caroline told herself. She was just hastening the inevitable. You will tell anyone who asks that the baby died tonight, Caroline said to Hannah. Do you understand? It died in its sleep. Peacefully. These things happen. You did everything you could. Hannah's eyes widened. Ma'am, please, the baby is alive, you can't. I can do anything I want, Caroline said coldly. You would do well to remember that. Now, you will say the child died. You will say you found it this morning, already gone. If you speak otherwise, if you tell anyone what you saw tonight, I will have you sold so far south that you'll never see daylight without a whip on your back. Do you understand me?" Hannah, shaking, nodded. Caroline left the cabin with the baby. She walked through the darkness back to the main house, going in through a side entrance that the servants used. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, to the nursery that had been prepared with such care. She laid the baby in the cradle. She looked down at it for a long moment. It stirred, making small sounds, but didn't wake. Caroline felt nothing. No guilt. No remorse. Just a cold certainty that this had to be done. She turned and left the nursery. And then she took a hammer and nails from the utility closet, and she nailed the door shut from the outside. The sound of hammering woke the household. Servants came running. Jonathan, confused and alarmed, came upstairs to find his wife driving nail after nail into the nursery door, her nightgown streaked with dirt, her hair wild, her face blank. "Caroline," he said carefully, "what are you doing?" She didn't look at him. "Making sure," she said. "Making sure it doesn't get out." "Making sure what doesn't get out?" "Caroline, what are you talking about?" She dropped the hammer then and turned to face him. "The child," she said. "Our child. The one I told you died. I lied. It's in there. It's in there and it needs to stay in there because it's wrong, Jonathan. It's wrong, and if anyone sees it, they'll know. They'll know what I did." And then she told him everything. Standing there in the hallway, with servants listening from the shadows, she confessed to it all. The forced encounters with Samuel. The months of deception. The child that was not Jonathan's. The plan to let it die quietly. Jonathan stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions: disbelief, rage, disgust, horror. When she finished, he said nothing. He simply walked past her, down the stairs, and out of the house. The servants scattered. No one wanted to be near Caroline Bellmont now. No one wanted to be associated with what she had done. And in the nursery, behind the nailed door, the baby cried. Weakly at first, then louder. It cried through the night and into the morning. It cried until its voice gave out and all that was left were hoarse, rattling gasps. By the time the sun rose on April 15th, the crying had stopped. Jonathan Bellmont left the plantation and didn't return for 3 days. When he came back, he had made arrangements. Caroline would be sent away to a private asylum in Virginia, far from South Carolina, far from anyone who might hear her story. It would be explained that her mind had broken under the strain of losing a child. She would live there quietly, tended by doctors who specialized in women's nervous disorders, until such time as she was deemed recovered. Which, Jonathan made clear to the asylum director, should be never. The nursery door stayed nailed shut. Jonathan couldn't bring himself to open it, to see what was in there. He told himself the child had died. It must have died. That was the only acceptable outcome. He paid Mrs. Talbot an enormous sum to leave the county and never speak of what she had witnessed. He tracked down the 2 enslaved women who had been present at the birth and had them sold to separate buyers in different states. Hannah, who had nursed the baby, was sold to a rice plantation on the coast, the very fate that Caroline had threatened Samuel with. And Samuel himself, Samuel was found one morning hanging from a tree at the edge of the cotton fields. The overseer ruled it suicide. No investigation was conducted. The body was buried in an unmarked grave. Ruth and the children were sold a week later, separated as Caroline had threatened, sent to different buyers in different states. The enslaved community on the Bellmont plantation knew what had happened. They knew about the baby behind the nailed door. They knew about Caroline's crime and Samuel's suffering and the brutal erasure of everyone who had witnessed the truth. But they couldn't speak of it, not openly. So they told it in whispers, passed it down through coded songs and careful stories, made sure it wasn't forgotten. But the nightmare wasn't over. Because something had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. Jonathan tried to go on with his life. He threw himself into managing the plantation. He made plans to remarry, thinking he could start fresh, produce legitimate heirs, and rebuild the family name. But things began to go wrong. The cotton crop failed that year, struck by boll weevils and an unseasonable frost. Jonathan lost thousands of dollars. Enslaved workers began dying at an unusual rate, struck down by a fever that the doctor couldn't identify. 3 of Jonathan's business partners withdrew from their arrangements, citing concerns about his management. Rumors spread that the Bellmont plantation was cursed. And then the deaths began. Jonathan's younger brother, Marcus, who lived in Charleston and had never even visited the plantation, died in September of 1858. He fell from his horse during a casual morning ride, broke his neck, and was dead before anyone could reach him. The horse was found standing calmly nearby, showing no signs of having been startled or spooked. Jonathan's sister, Elizabeth, died in December. She simply didn't wake up one morning. She was 34 years old, in good health, with no history of illness. The doctor who examined her body could find no cause of death. Her heart had simply stopped. In January of 1859, Jonathan's elderly mother, who lived on a small estate 50 miles away, died in a house fire. She was the only casualty. Everyone else in the house escaped. But she was found in her bed, burned beyond recognition, even though the fire had barely touched that part of the house. Jonathan began to drink. He sat up at night, listening to sounds in the house. Servants reported that he would sometimes stand outside the nursery door on the 3rd floor, his ear pressed to the wood, as if listening for something. When asked what he was doing, he wouldn't answer. He just walked away. In March of 1859, exactly 1 year after Samuel's death, Jonathan received a letter. It was delivered by a stranger, a black man who handed it to Jonathan and then disappeared before anyone could question him. The letter was written in a careful hand, with no signature. It said only, "The child you left to die is still there. And it will not rest until your line is ended." Jonathan burned the letter immediately. He tried to dismiss it as the work of someone trying to extort him or frighten him. But that night, he heard it. A sound from the 3rd floor. A thin, keening wail that seemed to come from behind the nailed door. He told himself it was the wind. Old houses made noises. That was all it was. But the sound came again the next night. And the next. Always after midnight. Always the same thin cry, like an infant in distress. Jonathan ordered the servants to stay away from the 3rd floor. He forbade anyone from going near the nursery. But the sounds continued. And then, in June of 1859, Jonathan's cousin, Thomas Bellmont, died. Thomas had been healthy, prosperous, living in Virginia with his wife and 3 children. He was found dead in his study one morning, sitting at his desk, his eyes open, his face frozen in an expression of terror. There was no mark on him. No sign of violence or illness. He had simply died of fright, though no one could say what had frightened him. With Thomas's death, only 2 male Bellmonts remained, Jonathan himself, and a distant cousin named William who lived in Georgia and had no children. Jonathan knew then that the letter had been right. His line was ending. Whether through curse or coincidence or divine punishment, the Bellmont name was dying. In September of 1859, Jonathan finally opened the nursery door. He took a crowbar and pried out the nails himself, working in silence while the servants watched from a distance. When the door finally swung open, he stepped inside. The room was untouched. The cradle still stood where it had been placed. The linens were still neatly folded. And in the cradle lay what remained of the child. The body was mummified, dried out in the sealed room. It looked less like an infant than like a small, wizened creature, its features shrunken and preserved. Jonathan stared at it for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. It was the same high, wild laughter that Caroline had made when she first held the baby. He was still laughing when he picked up the body, carried it downstairs, and walked out into the fields. The servants followed at a distance, unsure what to do. Jonathan carried the small body all the way to the place where Samuel had been found hanging. He laid it on the ground there. "I'm sorry," he said. Though it wasn't clear if he was talking to Samuel or to the child or to God. Then he went back to the house, went up to his study, and shot himself. He left no note. No explanation. Just a single sentence written on a piece of paper on his desk: "It ends here." But it didn't end there. Because William Bellmont, the last male heir, was still alive. He inherited the plantation, though he never lived there. He couldn't bring himself to enter the house. Instead, he tried to sell it, but no one would buy it. The reputation had spread too far. The plantation had become known as a cursed place. William managed the estate remotely for 3 years. The enslaved people were sold off gradually. The fields went unplanted. The house began to decay. In 1862, William Bellmont died in that hotel room in Charleston. His wife found him in the morning, lying peacefully in bed as if asleep, but cold and still. The doctor could find no cause. His heart had simply stopped, just like his cousin Elizabeth's, just like so many others. With William's death, the Bellmont line ended completely. There were no more males. The few remaining female relatives changed their names through marriage or simply stopped using the Bellmont name. The estate was eventually seized for unpaid taxes. The enslaved people who remained were freed or scattered during the Civil War. The house was left empty. Over the years, attempts were made to repurpose it, to use the land, but nothing succeeded. Every venture failed. Every person who tried to live there reported strange sounds, disturbing dreams, and a pervasive sense of being watched. In 1923, a development company bought the property with plans to demolish the house and build new homes. The demolition crew arrived on a Monday morning. They started on the ground floor, but when they reached the 3rd floor and found the nursery, something happened. The foreman, a man named Jack Peterson, later told reporters that when they opened the nursery door, which had been nailed shut again at some point, they found strange marks on the walls. Scratches, as if made by small fingers. And in the center of the room, drawn in what looked like soot or ash, was a symbol none of them recognized. But more than that, Peterson said, there was a feeling in that room. A cold, heavy presence that made it hard to breathe. 3 of his workers refused to enter. One man who did step inside immediately started vomiting and couldn't stop until he left the house entirely. The crew abandoned the job that afternoon. The company tried to hire other crews, but word had spread. No one would take the work. Eventually, the company gave up. The house was left standing. Over the decades since, there have been occasional trespassers. Teenagers on dares. Urban explorers. Ghost hunters. Most leave quickly. Some leave running. A few have tried to document what they found, taking photos or video, but the equipment always malfunctions on the 3rd floor. Cameras stop working. Recorders capture only static. Phone batteries die instantly. The local historical society has tried to preserve what records exist of the Bellmont family, but even that has proven difficult. Documents go missing. Files get misfiled. It's as if the history itself resists being told. But the story survives in other ways. The descendants of the people who were enslaved on the Bellmont plantation have carried it forward. They've kept Samuel's name alive, and Ruth's name, and the names of their children who were sold away. They've made sure that the crime committed against Samuel, and the way he was destroyed for something he was forced to do, is remembered. And they've kept alive the story of what was born in that house. The child that Caroline Bellmont brought into the world through violence and paid for with her sanity and her husband's life and the end of her family's entire line. Because that's what the child was, in the end. Not a monster. Not a curse in itself. But a living embodiment of every sin that family had committed. Every enslaved person they had brutalized. Every family they had torn apart. Every life they had treated as property. All of it, concentrated into one small body that was born from rape and abandoned to die and became a weight that the Bellmont family could not escape. The child was innocent. But what it represented was so unbearable, so undeniable, that its very existence destroyed the family that tried to erase it. This is what ended the Bellmont line. Not supernatural revenge. Not a literal curse. But the simple, terrible truth that some crimes are so great that they cannot be hidden or forgotten. They mark you. They follow you. They destroy everything you try to build on their foundation. Caroline Bellmont lived out the rest of her life in that asylum in Virginia. She died in 1889, 31 years after the night she nailed the nursery door shut. The asylum records say she spoke very little in all that time. But on certain nights, she would wake screaming, saying that she could hear a baby crying. The staff assumed it was guilt-driven delusion. But some of the other patients, and some of the night staff, reported that they could hear it too. A thin, distant cry, like an infant in distress, coming from a room where no baby existed. Perhaps it was just the wind. Perhaps it was the sound of pipes or the settling of an old building. Or perhaps it was the echo of a crime that could never be undone, reverberating through time, refusing to be silenced. The house still stands today. The county has tried several times to condemn it and tear it down, but the attempts always falter. Legal complications. Budget issues. Political opposition. It's as if the building wants to remain, a monument to what happened within its walls. If you drive past it now, you'll see it at the end of that long, overgrown drive. 3 stories of decay. Windows like empty eyes. And on the 3rd floor, if you look carefully, you can see the window that's still boarded shut. Local children are told not to go near it. But children don't always listen. And sometimes, late at night, people report seeing a light in that 3rd floor window. A faint, flickering light, like a candle. Even though the house has no electricity and hasn't had occupants in over a century. Sometimes, they say, if you stand outside on a still night, you can hear something. A sound that might be wind through broken boards or might be something else. Something that sounds almost like crying. But no one stays long enough to be sure. This is the story of the Bellmont Plantation. The story of Caroline and Jonathan and Samuel and Ruth and the child that was born from violence and died in darkness and somehow, in dying, brought down an entire family line. It's a story about power and cruelty and the wages of sin. It's a story about how the people we dehumanize have names and families and lives that matter. And it's a story about how some crimes create echoes that never fade. The Bellmont name is gone now. But the house remains. And so does the memory of what happened there. Carried forward by the descendants of those who survived. Whispered in local legends. Preserved in the few documents that escaped the fire. Because some stories need to be told. Not to frighten. Not to entertain. But to remember. To bear witness. To make sure that the people who suffered are not forgotten, and that the crimes committed against them are not erased. Samuel had a name. He had a wife and children. He had a life that mattered. And what was done to him was evil, pure and simple. The child born from that evil was innocent. And both of them, Samuel and the child, deserved better than what they received. This is their story. This is what happened when a plantation owner's wife forced an enslaved man to do the unthinkable. This is what was born from that crime. And this is how it ended a family line that thought itself untouchable. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that history is full of horrors that we need to remember and learn from, then subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And share this story with others, because these histories matter. They shape us. They teach us. And they remind us that justice, even when delayed, even when it comes in unexpected forms, eventually finds its way. Thank you for listening to the end. Thank you for bearing witness to Samuel's story, and Ruth's story, and the story of a child who was born into a world that refused to see it as human. Their names and their suffering deserve to be remembered. And now, because you've heard this, they will be.